Hello friends, happy International Women's Day. Today I'd like to talk about something different from normal because believe it or not, I have a wide array of interests. Today I want to talk about early feminism in Britain. In our pop culture, we tend to talk about feminism as happening in waves. The first wave being the suffrage movement, starting at the turn of the 20th century. The second wave around reproductive freedoms and work equality in the late 60s and early 70s. The third wave in the 90s, which is a bit more vague, but talks about intersectionality, meaning how race and class interacts with gender. And the fourth wave, which began in the 2010s, is, to oversimplify it, the hashtag MeToo movement, and a focus on including LGBTQ people within the movement. I think this way of framing feminist history has the effect of erasing earlier feminist movements from our collective consciousness. I would argue the suffrage movement is at best the third wave of feminism. So what's the first wave? The first wave is the right to education. The most famous work of this wave you might be familiar with is Mary Wollstonecraft's The Vindications of the Rights of Women, which was published in 1792. But this is actually pretty late for the first wave. Arguments in favour of educating girls made by women were being written a century earlier. Mary Astell was an English philosopher who wrote a number of pamphlets. Our focus is one with the slightly wordy title, A Serious Proposal to the Ladies for the Advancement of Their True and Greatest Interests, written under the pseudonym By a Lover of Her Sex, which was published in 1694 with a second volume in 1697. So in this video I'm going to talk about, as I see it, the first real wave of feminism which makes all others possible. So let's begin. Mary Astell was born on the 12th of November 1666 in Newcastle upon Tyne, which Katie Charwood, history harlot and reader of books, would remark is fairly unusual for a non-royal historic woman. Seriously, I genuinely recommend Who Did What Now. It's a great podcast. I'll put the thing up there and I'll put a link down there. Anyway, the historical consensus is that she received an informal education from her uncle, who had been to Cambridge, although he died when she was 13. Her biographer Florence Smith tells us that she moved to London at the age of 20 following her mother's death. She was fairly high up in the social circles of London, being friends with some prominent courtiers, such as the Duchess of Malazan, who had been the mistress of Charles II, and Lady Catherine Jones, who had enough sway to petition private members' bills in Parliament and get them through. She was also friends with intellectual women like Elizabeth Elstob, who was an expert in Anglo-Saxon studies, who had published a book on the grammar of Old English, the first written in modern English, alongside other intellectuals such as fellow philosopher and possible journalist Lady Anne Coventry. Another example of a prominent woman she interacted with was Mary Montagu, who wrote an early form of travel writing from the Ottoman Empire, where her husband was the ambassador. But most importantly, Mary Montagu brought back the idea of inoculation from smallpox from the Ottoman Empire. To be clear, Mary Montagu was the first person in England to advocate what would become vaccines 75 years before Edward Jenner would conduct his experiments, which is not what we were taught in Year 9 science class, but it's true. I bring this to your attention because it's important to understand that there was, in the late 17th and early 18th century, an intellectual circle of women who had a real impact on the world, as so often in history women's achievements are swept under the rug. I'm not going to pretend to have read all of A Serious Proposal, or I decided on this topic yesterday, but I'm going to give a summary of her work, and hopefully when I've had more time to read, I'll go into a bit more depth, like I did with John Locke and Separation of Powers, which, as a side note, Mary Astell did not like John Locke. She thought liberty and equality, as he expressed them, was a populist tool by disgruntled aristocrats. And that's not her saying that, but someone's quoting her as saying that, so, I have seen Mary Astell being described as a proto-feminist because she doesn't address patriarchal structures or call for equal rights. I disagree, as it's the intellectual equivalent of the Council of Nicaea criticising Jesus for not knowing about Paul's letters. A Serious Proposal to the Ladies is very feminist, even if at first glance it may appear to be something that could be written by a leading misogynist. And what I mean by this is its starting point is to call her readers cheap and contemptible, and also vulgar. And that she has the answer to change this and raise the value and beauty of women, which, if you don't keep reading, does sound like something you might get from Jordan Peterson. Astell's argument starts with the premise that women are of a lower character than men, but what she is doing is taking an early approach on the nature versus nurture debate, and she comes down hard on the nurture side of the debate. She took the common stereotypes of the time of a woman as being overly emotional, or that being defective in reason, or overly concerned with appearance, and instead of just saying no, she said yes, but why? And the answer that she gives is a lack of education, both literally and the way they are socialised. Now, I remember in A-level psychology a study where an adult was sent into a room with a baby and told to play with them from a selection of toys. And sometimes the babies would be dressed in pink and others in blue. And this would affect how the adult would try to play with the child, with dolls for girls and more spatial toys for boys, which raised significant questions about what we consider to be differences between men and women, which might actually be trained behaviours rather than naturally occurring. And Mary Astell is writing about this phenomenon 330 years ago, when she writes, "The soil is rich and would, if well cultivated, produce a noble harvest. If then the unskilled managers not only permit the noxious weeds, though we shall suffer by the neglect, yet they ought not in justice to blame any but themselves if they reap the fruit of this their foolish conduct. Women are from their very infancy debarred those advantages with the want of which they are afterwards reproached, and nursed up in those vices which hereafter be upbraided to them." Astell is livid with the parents of these daughters who do not prepare them for the world. There is of course a spiritual element in this too, as she sees the parents as also risking the child's eternal soul. She argues that girls are being taught to be ignorant and delicate, and a number of other traits that later affect their actions, and that if men take offence to those actions, it is their own fault for denying the girls the benefits of an ingenious and liberal education. This is why I disagree with the summation of Astell as a proto-feminist. She may not name the structure or provide it with the omnipotence and self-awareness that later feminists give it, but she does describe something similar to patriarchy. She also talks about how education is necessary for self-esteem and valuing yourself, and without it, not only might somebody be easily manipulated, but also value themselves based on superficial things like beauty or money, which is a huge bedrock of feminist discussion. Not necessarily in agreement with Astell, I remind you she is part of the establishment in the late 1600s, but nevertheless these themes remain current. She goes on to talk about how, if ignorance is a social norm, that once these girls and women acquire agency, most of them wouldn't think of trying to gain education, and that the customs of society heavily discourage women who try to find education, limiting the number even further. So what is Astell's solution to this huge societal problem? Astell argues essentially for segregation, for women to create their own educational institutions and separate from men, including colleges, so universities for women, and that women should devote themselves to education, and by doing so, women will protect themselves from ethical dangers. Again, this is strongly linked to the Christian faith, and so it's vanity and pride which Astell sees amongst the dangers of women. But by withdrawing from society and meditating, she argues women will gain self-knowledge. She lays out her argument for this in part 1 and then gives advice on how to do it best in part 2. She argues that women should study philosophy to improve rational thinking, which would also help women focus on their immortal souls over fashion and beauty. Again, as I said before, a casual reading of this does appear to have misogynistic tropes and could be condescending. We just have to remember that this was written at a time when your religion determined whether you could hold public office or go to university, and your afterlife was a genuine, serious concern. By withdrawing from society and focusing on education, Astell thinks it will give women rights and opportunities that they did not have before. I'm fully aware that it is not ideal to talk about masculine traits as desired and feminine traits as negative. Astell is working in a time where to say, well, maybe men should just behave more like women probably would not have gotten her anywhere at all. So this is the path she's taken. I'm not saying it's great, I'm just saying this is what she did. So what is the legacy of her work here? A serious proposal to the ladies was a genuinely influential text when it was published. Astell appeared in a book called the Numismata, or Medals, which collected a list of prominent ancient and modern people. She was also referred to in letters to the Electress of Sophia in 1697, who was the presumptuous Protestant heir after Princess Anne, and would have been queen if she hadn't died 2 months before Anne. Daniel Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe and general intellectual heavyweight, also built upon her work with more emphasis on the secular side of education. Of course, her proposal was also heavily opposed, especially by the church, with Bishop Burnet blocking one woman who wanted to give £10,000, which is £1,650,000 today, towards the school. Her biographer Smith thinks this woman was Princess Anne. This was not because Burnet was opposed to educated women, but because he thought Astell's ideas were too Catholic. Which is weird because Astell was constantly writing in defence of the Anglican Church. So, while she stopped writing political pamphlets in 1709, Astell continued her efforts. Although she was unsuccessful in gaining support for the creation of a women's college attached to a university, she was successful in working alongside her friend Catherine Jones and Lady Anne Coventry in creating a school for the daughters of army veterans at Chelsea Hospital. Funds given by another friend, Lady Elizabeth Hastings, in 1729 were still being used to educate girls in 1916. Elizabeth Elstob, who I mentioned earlier, should have been a university professor in linguistics or history, but because she was a woman, this option was not available to her. And when her brother, who had encouraged her work, died, she was in debt because she was a patron of Queen Anne, who had died before the money she was promised for the publications was sent. It's not easy to find what happened next. There's not enough publicly available data. But as far as I can tell, she tried to set up a school along the lines of Astell's manifesto in Chelsea, which was very popular, but in trying to make it accessible, she only charged 4 pence per week per pupil, and she had to close the school after 6 months. She then either taught at or created a village school in Evesham for 20 years before ending up as a private tutor to the children of the Duke of Portland. I personally feel Elstob is a woman who could have been one of the academic greats and revolutionised her area of study and was completely undervalued. Like, she could have been Tolkien before Tolkien, honestly, when it comes to Anglo-Saxon studies. As well as a serious proposal to the ladies, Mary Astell also wrote reflections upon marriage, occasioned by the Duke and Duchess of Marathon's case. Now, this is a really important text, but I think that it is part of the second wave, which is property rights and legal separatism, so I will cover it another time. In a way, Mary Astell both launches the first and second wave of feminism, which will be built upon by Wollstonecraft and others over the 19th century, like Sojourner Truth in America and Josephine Butler in Britain, both of whom also linked their feminism to Christianity. This is why Mary Astell is someone worth knowing about. She is the foundation upon which one of the most important social movements in the last millennium would be built. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you'd like me to cover more on feminist texts or history of the movement, let me know. Research is my drugs. And happy International Women's Day, guys. I hope you have a good day.